The memory of the gunshot from earlier days still lingered in Harlem, not as noise, but as absence. The kind of absence that filled rooms long after the door had closed. In the weeks following the incident, everyone pretended not to discuss. Bumpy Johnson moved through the neighborhood with the same measured stride he always had, his coat pressed, his eyes observant, without ever appearing restless. His presence steady in a city that had grown used to chaos. The younger men whispered that something had shifted, that the streets felt tighter, quieter, as if even the brick walls had learned to listen. Bumpy never corrected them. He had learned long ago that silence carried more authority than explanation, and that power, when truly held, did not announce itself. What concerned him now was not the past violence, but the future arrogance it invited from men who believed fear was a license. That arrogance arrived wearing badges and polished shoes, carried in the posture of men who believed the law existed for them rather than through them. The raids began subtly at first, always just outside the rules, always justified with paperwork that looked clean enough to survive a glance, but not a soul. Black-owned businesses were visited repeatedly, questioned, delayed, humiliated in front of customers who slowly stopped coming. A tailor on 135th Street was shut down for a permit issue that had never mattered before. A jazz club lost its liquor license for reasons no one could explain. A grocery owner, elderly and stooped, was handcuffed publicly over a ledger discrepancy that vanished once the cameras were gone. These were not accidents. They were rehearsals, testing how much dignity could be stripped before resistance showed its face. Bumpy saw the pattern clearly, and what troubled him most was not the cruelty, the confidence with which it was delivered. The city wanted him provoked. He knew that. There were men downtown who had built careers on waiting for someone like him to make a mistake, to step out of character, to become exactly what they said he was. Bumpy refused to give them that satisfaction. Instead, he listened. He attended wakes, stood quietly in the back of overcrowded churches, placed his hand on trembling shoulders without saying a word. Mothers cried into his coat, not because they expected him to fix everything, but because his presence reminded them that they were not invisible. That was the power no badge could confiscate. That was the authority no courtroom could dismiss. The pressure reached a new level when a young porter named Isaiah, barely 22 and barely surviving on tips, was accused of pulling a weapon during a routine stop outside a hotel where white men drank freely and laughed loudly. Witnesses said Isaiah never raised his hands fast enough, that his fear was interpreted as threat, that the officers fired first and justified later. The official report was typed before Isaiah's blood had dried on the pavement. Bumpy read it slowly, his face unreadable, his breathing steady. He folded the paper neatly and placed it on the desk beside him, not in anger, but with the care one used for something fragile. He understood then that the injustice had crossed from harassment into message. The city was no longer testing limits. It was sending a warning. The funeral drew half of Harlem, spilling onto sidewalks and into the street, black coats blending into one long river of grief. Bumpy arrived without entourage, took his seat without ceremony, and listened as Isaiah's mother struggled through words she had not prepared for this kind of ending. When she collapsed into sobs, the room broke with her. Bumpy did not cry. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, long enough to absorb the weight of what had been stolen, then opened them again with resolve, sharpened rather than dulled. He knew now that restraint alone would no longer protect his people. Something else was required. Not force, not retaliation, but clarity. That clarity arrived unexpectedly in the form of an invitation that was not truly an invitation at all. A city committee, newly formed and proudly advertised as a step toward community engagement, requested Bumpy's presence at a public forum downtown. The language was polite, the tone cooperative, but the subtext was unmistakable. They wanted him visible. They wanted him framed. They wanted him on record. Advisors urged him not to go. Friends warned him it was a trap dressed as dialogue. Bumpy listened, thanked them, and said he would attend. Not because he trusted the room, because he trusted himself. The auditorium was all polished wood and high ceilings. It's a kind of place built to amplify voices that already believed they deserved to be heard. Cameras lined the walls. Officials sat in rows with hands folded, faces arranged into expressions of patience that did not reach their eyes. When Bumpy entered, the murmurs were immediate, some curious, some resentful, all attentive. He took his seat when directed, folded his hands, and waited. The moderator spoke of unity, of progress, of shared responsibility. Each phrase polished smooth enough to slip past the truth without touching it. When questions were opened to the floor, they came loaded with implication. Framed as concern but weighted with accusation, crime, influence, control, respectability, words designed to corner rather than understand. Bumpy did not respond immediately. He allowed the questions to stack, the tension to grow, the room to reveal its impatience. When he finally stood, it was without drama. He adjusted his jacket, looked out over the audience, and spoke calmly, his voice low but steady, carrying without effort. He did not defend himself. He did not accuse. He told a story instead, about a boy who worked hard, followed the rules, and died anyway, because fear was mistaken for authority. He spoke of dignity as something inherited, not granted. He reminded the room that law without justice was only noise, loud enough to intimidate but too hollow to last. His words did not rise. They did not threaten. They simply settled into the space, heavy enough to silence it. The effect was immediate and unsettling. The cameras kept rolling, but no one spoke. Officials shifted in their seats. The moderator glanced at his notes, unsure how to proceed. For the first time that evening, control had slipped, not through confrontation, through truth delivered without ornament. Bumpy ended with a single sentence, spoken softly, almost kindly. He said that power revealed itself not in how quickly one could pull a trigger, but in how confidently one could choose not to. Then he sat down. The room remained quiet long after the applause should have come. Some lowered their heads. Others stared forward, confronted with a reflection they had not expected to see. Outside, Harlem waited, not for vengeance, but for acknowledgement. Bumpy rose, walked out, and returned to the streets that had shaped him, leaving behind a sound that did not echo, but resonated all the same. The city would respond. He knew that. The injustice was not finished, but something irreversible had begun. The narrative had shifted, not through force, but through composure. And the men who relied on chaos now faced a problem they could not arrest or erase. Dignity had spoken, and it had been heard. By the time the echoes of the forum faded from the polished walls downtown, Harlem had already absorbed what mattered. Not the headlines, which twisted Bumpy Johnson's words into something cautious and incomplete, nor the clipped radio segments that framed the evening as civil dialogue, but the feeling that settled into the streets like a held breath. Men stood longer outside barbershops before locking up. Women lingered on stoops after sunset, speaking in low voices that carried resolve instead of fear. Even the children sensed it, the way one senses a storm, not by thunder, but by the sudden stillness of birds. Bumpy Johnson had not raised his voice, had not challenged anyone directly, yet something fundamental had shifted. The city, accustomed to loud men and louder mistakes, did not know what to do with composure that refused to bend. That confusion bred retaliation, though not the kind that arrived with sirens. It came instead through procedure, through ink and envelopes, through meetings held behind doors that never opened for people like Isaiah's mother. Inspections increased. Permits were delayed. Loans were denied without explanation. Men who had lived their entire lives paying rent on time suddenly found eviction notices, taped to their doors for violations no one could define. The cruelty was calculated precisely because it was deniable. No one could point to a single act and call it war, but everyone could feel the siege tightening. Bumpy observed it all with the patience of a man who understood that pressure revealed character faster than force ever could. Those closest to him worried. They saw the toll the waiting took, not on his temper, but on the people who looked to him as proof that dignity still had a place in a city that seemed determined to erase it. They urged him to move faster, to speak louder, to remind the authorities that restraint should not be mistaken for weakness. Bumpy listened, as he always did, his eyes attentive, his posture relaxed, his mind already several steps ahead. He reminded them gently that reaction was exactly what his opponents wanted, that the men abusing power had written their plans assuming he would behave like a stereotype they had rehearsed for years. His refusal to do so was not hesitation. It was strategy. The next provocation was personal, delivered with the precision of someone who had studied his habits. A longtime associate, a man Bumpy trusted not for his usefulness, but for his integrity, was arrested on charges that made little sense and less effort at credibility. The evidence was thin. The timing was perfect. The message was unmistakable. This was no longer about policy or optics. It was about leverage. When Bumpy received the news, he closed his eyes briefly, not in anger, but in acknowledgement. The city had finally revealed its hand. He visited the holding facility the following morning, walking through corridors that smelled of disinfectant and resignation. Guards straightened when they saw him, unsure whether to assert authority or avoid attention. He greeted them politely, thanked them for their time, and waited without complaint. When he was finally allowed to speak with his associate, the man tried to apologize, tried to explain how quickly everything had gone wrong. Bumpy placed a calming hand on his shoulder and told him there was nothing to explain, that this was not a failure, but a test, that he would be home soon. The certainty in Bumpy's voice did more than comfort. It steadied the room. Word of the arrest spread quickly, and with it came the rumors the city always loved more than truth. Some claimed Bumpy was losing control. Others whispered that the authorities were finally closing in. A few hoped openly that this would end his influence once and for all. Bumpy allowed the noise to grow. He understood that misinformation exhausted people faster than fear, and that exhaustion made them careless. Meanwhile, he worked quietly, meeting with clergy, lawyers, business owners, men and women who had nothing in common except a shared understanding that injustice thrived best when people stood alone. What none of his adversaries anticipated was the coalition forming beneath their notice. Not a mob, not an organization that could be labeled and dismantled, but a network of ordinary citizens, each willing to speak one truth in one room at one time. Shopkeepers documented harassment. Bankers recorded discriminatory refusals. Clerks kept copies of contradictory orders. Lawyers who had once feared association now found courage in numbers. Bumpy never instructed them. He merely listened, connected, and waited. His role was not to command, but to align. The city announced a formal inquiry into community tensions, a move designed to appear conciliatory while controlling the narrative. Public hearings were scheduled. Testimonies were limited. Time was restricted. The rules favored those accustomed to speaking uninterrupted. Bumpy received his notice last, allotted fewer minutes than anyone else. He smiled faintly when he read it. He understood then that the city still believed the room belonged to them. The hearing day arrived heavy with expectation. The chamber filled early, officials seated confidently, reporters poised for spectacle. When Bumpy entered, the room shifted in a way no microphone could capture. He took his place, without expression, hands folded, eyes attentive. One by one, officials spoke, reciting statistics stripped of context. Policies polished to reflect progress while hiding consequence. They spoke of order, of safety, of necessity. When it was Bumpy's turn, the moderator reminded him of his time limit before he even stood. Bumpy rose slowly, adjusted his jacket, and thanked the committee for the opportunity. His voice was calm, almost conversational, yet it carried effortlessly. He did not argue the numbers. He did not challenge the language. Instead, he asked permission to submit additional material for the record. The moderator hesitated, then nodded, expecting paperwork. What followed was not paper, but people. One by one, individuals stood throughout the chamber, each introduced only by name and profession. A tailor, a school teacher, a loan officer, a landlord. Each spoke briefly, precisely, describing a single incident, a single decision, a single injustice. None raised their voices. None embellished. The effect was cumulative and devastating. The room grew quieter with each testimony. The narrative the officials had constructed unraveling thread by thread. Bumpy remained standing throughout, silent, his presence anchoring the moment. When the final speaker finished, the moderator attempted to regain control. But the authority had already drained from his voice. Bumpy was asked if he wished to add anything. He paused, as if considering, then shook his head gently. He said only that the truth did not need more time than it required. That dignity, once spoken aloud, tended to stand on its own. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy with realization. Cameras captured faces that could no longer hide behind procedure. Officials avoided eye contact. The audience did not applaud. They did not need to. Something far more powerful had occurred. The city had been confronted not with rebellion, but with reflection. Outside, the crowd waited. When Bumpy emerged, they searched his face for signs of victory or defeat. He gave them neither. He nodded once respectfully and walked back into Harlem as the evening settled around him. The injustice was not over. The consequences were still forming. But the balance had shifted again, more decisively this time. Those who abused power now understood they were being seen not by an enemy, but by history. And history, Bumpy knew, had a way of remembering not the loudest men in the room, but the quiet ones who changed it. By the time the city issued its official response to the hearings, Harlem already understood what the paperwork would try to deny. The language was cautious, layered in phrases that suggested concern without responsibility, acknowledgement without admission. Committees would be formed, procedures reviewed, promises made vague enough to survive forgetting. Newspapers ran restrained headlines, careful not to name villains, careful not to celebrate dignity too loudly. Yet beneath that careful restraint, something irreversible had taken root. The men who had relied on shadows now found themselves standing under a light they could not switch off. And at the center of that light stood Bumpy Johnson. Composed as ever, neither triumphant nor satisfied, because he had never mistaken recognition for justice. The retaliation came swiftly, and this time it came wearing desperation. A federal task force was announced with dramatic urgency, its formation justified by a sudden concern for public safety. The streets were flooded with unfamiliar uniforms, men who did not know Harlem and did not care to learn it. Their presence was meant to unsettle, to remind everyone who still held guns, badges, the authority to ruin lives in the space between sunset and sunrise. Curfews were suggested, then enforced. Stops became more aggressive. Questions turned into commands. The city wanted fear back where it belonged. What it did not expect was how little fear it now inspired. Bumpy watched the escalation without visible reaction. Those closest to him saw the strain only in the way his silence grew longer, more deliberate, as if he were weighing every breath against consequence. He understood the danger clearly. The task force was not interested in order. It was hunting a moment. A single misstep, it could magnify into justification. All it needed was noise. One shot, one shove, one raised voice caught on camera. The irony did not escape him. The men, claiming to protect the city, were praying for chaos. The moment they chose arrived on a rainy evening outside a community hall where residents had gathered for a peaceful meeting, determined not to retreat into their homes simply because intimidation had returned. The rain blurred the streetlights into long streaks of white and gold as officers moved in, citing violations no one could hear clearly over the storm. Tempers flared, not violently, but emotionally, the kind of flare that came from being pushed one time too many. A young officer, nervous and eager, misread the tension. His hand moved faster than his judgment. The sound that followed was sharp, unmistakable, and devastating in its finality. The bodyguard fell first. He had been standing near the entrance, unarmed, positioned, there not as muscle, but as presence. A familiar face, meant to reassure the crowd. When the shot rang out, it did not echo the way movies taught people to expect. It landed instead with a sickening dullness, absorbed by rain, flesh, and shock. For a fraction of a second, the world seemed to stop breathing. Then screams began to rise, chaos, threatening to spill into exactly the spectacle the city had been waiting for. Bumpy stepped forward. He did not run. He did not shout. He moved with a calm that cut through panic like a blade through fog. He knelt beside the fallen man, pressing his hand firmly over the wound, his coat darkening instantly with blood. Around him, officers froze, uncertain whether to advance or retreat, their authority suddenly fragile. The crowd watched, suspended between terror and rage, waiting for Bumpy to do what the city had spent years insisting he would eventually do. Instead, he looked up, his voice, when he spoke, was steady, low, and unmistakably clear. He told everyone to step back. He told them help was coming. He told them this was not the moment to lose themselves. The words were simple, almost ordinary, yet they carried a gravity that no command ever had. People listened. The shouting softened. The crowd obeyed not because they were afraid, but because they trusted him. The officers stood, stunned. The young one who had fired the shot stared at his own hands as if seeing them for the first time. Sirens approached, growing louder, closer, unavoidable now. Bumpy did not look at the shooter with hatred. He looked at him with something far more unsettling. Disappointment. Not personal, moral. When the ambulance arrived, Bumpy rose slowly, bloodied but composed, allowing the medics to take over. Cameras were everywhere now, capturing an image the city had never planned for. A man they had painted as volatile, kneeling calmly in the rain, holding together the very order they had nearly destroyed. A bodyguard wounded by authority, not protected by it. A crowd restrained not by force, but by dignity. At the hospital, Bumpy waited in silence, refusing interviews, refusing statements. When told that officials wished to speak with him immediately, he declined politely. He said he would speak when the man who had been shot could speak again. The message spread faster than any headline. By morning, it had reached offices that rarely felt consequences. This time, the sound that changed history was not the gunshot itself, but what followed it. The silence Bumpy imposed on the chaos. And the restraint that exposed cruelty more clearly than any accusation ever could. The investigation that followed could no longer be shaped quietly. Video footage surfaced. Witnesses came forward unafraid. The task force's narrative collapsed under its own contradictions. Charges were filed, not buried. Policies were suspended, not defended. And in Harlem, something extraordinary happened. People stood taller. Not because the danger was gone, but because their dignity had been restored in the most public way imaginable. Weeks later, when Bumpy finally spoke, it was not at a podium or behind a microphone. It was in a small room with the bodyguard's family, his words measured, sincere, and free of promise he could not keep. He told them that their pain had been seen, not exploited. That their loss had forced a reckoning no one could undo. That sometimes history did not change with speeches or violence, but with the courage to remain human when the world expected something else. When he walked back into Harlem that evening, the streets were quiet again, but this time the quiet felt different. It was no longer fear holding its breath. It was respect. The city had pulled a trigger, hoping for noise. What it received instead was a sound far more dangerous to injustice. Restraint made visible. Dignity made undeniable, and a legacy secured not by force, but by moral authority that refused to break. And that was the sound history remembered.